Officer Walt Briggs had 6 days left on the job, 30 years in uniform, and he'd already started counting the mornings on one hand. So when a soaked, shivering puppy planted itself in front of his boots that cold October dawn and refused to move, Walt figured it was just one more small thing to deal with before the coffee kicked in. He was wrong. The little dog wouldn't leave him. It followed him into the diner. It followed him back out. Every time Walt turned to walk away, the puppy cried like its heart was tearing in half, then ran and stood in front of him again, staring up with wet eyes, begging him to understand something it couldn't say out loud. Walt didn't know it yet, but that puppy had walked almost 3 miles through the freezing dark to find exactly one person. And when Walt finally figured out why the little dog had chosen him, of all the people in that town, on that street, on that last quiet week of his career, it broke something loose in him that 30 years on the force never had. Stay with me for this one. It's going to sit with you for a while. And before we start, do me a favor and tap that subscribe button, because stories like this one are exactly why this channel exists. And I'm genuinely curious. Where in the world are you watching from this morning? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Now, let me tell you about Walt and the puppy. The town of Hollow Creek didn't ask much of its police force. A fender bender now and then. Kids setting off fireworks 2 weeks after the 4th. Somebody's cattle getting loose on County Road 9. In 30 years, Walt Briggs had drawn his weapon exactly twice, and both times it turned out to be nothing. He used to think that was a disappointment. Lately, he thought it was a mercy. That morning he pulled his cruiser into the gravel lot beside Marge's diner the same way he had for most of his adult life. Same spot, same faint smell of frost and diesel in the air. The sun wasn't up yet, just a gray suggestion behind the ridge, and his breath hung in front of his face like smoke. 58 years old. Bad knee. A retirement party already scheduled at the VFW Hall for the following Saturday, with a sheet cake somebody was ordering from the grocery store in town. Walt had seen the flyer. His own name in that curly font, the words, "Thank you for your service" underneath, and a clip art badge that wasn't even the right shape. 30 years, and that was the summary. A sheet cake and a badge that wasn't quite right. He'd been thinking about it more than he wanted to admit. Not in a dramatic way, just a low gray feeling that followed him around, the kind that shows up when a man starts adding things up and doesn't love the total. He'd kept the peace in a town that mostly kept itself. He'd written more warnings than tickets. He'd talked a few teenagers out of doing something stupid, driven a few drunks home instead of booking them, sat with an old man once for 4 hours after the man's wife died so he wouldn't have to be alone in the house with her empty chair. Good things, all of them, small things, nothing that would ever make the paper. Walt had spent 3 decades wondering quietly whether any of it had actually mattered to anyone but him. He shut off the engine and reached for the door handle. That's when he saw the puppy. It was standing at the edge of the gravel lot near the road, and at first Walt genuinely thought it might be a coyote pup. It was so filthy, dark fur matted with mud, one ear flopped over, ribs showing through in the thin gray light. A shepherd mixed with something, maybe a bit of collie in the long snout and the sharp, worried eyes. 5 months old, if that. Too young to be out alone on a morning cold enough to see your breath. Walt figured it belonged to one of the ranches up the road and had slipped a fence. He climbed out, shut the door, and started toward the diner. The puppy came straight for him. Not the shy way strays usually move, ducking and circling, testing whether you're safe. This one ran right at his boots and stopped so close it nearly tripped him, then sat down hard in the frost and looked up. It didn't bark. It just stared, its whole small body trembling, and let out a sound that wasn't quite a whine and wasn't quite a cry. "Hey now," Walt said. He crouched, and his knee popped loud in the quiet. "Where'd you come from?" The puppy stood, took 2 steps toward the road, then looked back at him. Waited. Took another step. Looked back again. Walt had grown up around dogs. He knew what a hungry dog looked like, what a scared dog looked like, what a dog that just wanted a scratch behind the ears looked like. This wasn't any of those. "You lost, buddy?" The puppy cried again and pawed at his boot. Walt stood up slowly, both hands on his good knee for leverage, and glanced toward the diner. Warm light, coffee, Marge already flipping the sign to open. Behind him, cold road and a shaking puppy. He almost walked inside. He'd tell you later that he almost walked inside and that he thinks about that almost more than anything else in the whole story. Instead, he sighed and he turned back around. "All right," he said. "What's got you so worked up?" Walt did go into the diner, just for a minute, to see if anyone recognized the dog. The second the glass door swung shut behind him, the puppy went to pieces. Walt heard it through the window, a high frantic scratching, tiny claws dragging down the metal kickplate, a cry that climbed higher and higher until Marge looked up from the register with her eyebrows halfway to her hairline. "That yours, Walt? Never seen it before this morning. Well, it sure has opinions about you leaving." Walt looked back through the glass. The puppy had its front paws up on the door now, standing on its hind legs, whole body shaking, and when it saw Walt through the window, it went even more desperate, like the sight of him just out of reach was worse than not seeing him at all. "You know anybody up on the Miller Road missing a pup?" Walt asked. Marge shook her head, filling a to-go cup without being asked. "Bennett's had a young one, I think. The old teacher, out past the bend. Ada." She set the coffee on the counter and slid it toward him. "Haven't seen her in a couple weeks, though. She keeps to herself since Harold passed." The name went by Walt without catching on anything. He picked up the coffee, thanked her, and pushed back out into the cold. The puppy nearly climbed his leg. It jumped and scrambled and pressed itself against his shin, and for 1 second Walt let himself think it was just an affectionate dog that had picked him out of the crowd. He crouched to give it a pat. The relief in the little animal lasted about 4 seconds. Then it backed off, ran toward the road, stopped, and looked over its shoulder at him. Same as before. Come on, please." "I can't just follow you," Walt told it, feeling a little foolish for talking to a dog like it could answer. "I've got a shift." The puppy sat down in the middle of the empty road and howled. A real howl, cracked and thin, the biggest sound that small a body could make, and something about it went into Walt sideways and stuck. He set his coffee on the hood of the cruiser and walked over, knelt down right there on the cold asphalt, ignoring the knee, and put his hands on the puppy so he could actually look at it. What he found stopped him. The pads of its paws were split and raw, worn down the way they only get from a long way on hard ground. Not a wander, a journey. There were burrs deep in the fur of its legs, the kind you pick up crossing ditches and fence lines, not trotting around a yard. And along one flank the fur was crusted with something dark that had dried into the coat. Walt worked a bit of it loose between 2 fingers and rubbed it, and his stomach dropped a half-inch. Blood. Not the puppy's, as far as he could tell. There wasn't a wound under it. He sat back on his heels. The gray light was coming up pink over the ridge now, and in it he could see the puppy clearly for the first time, and everything about it was wrong for a lost dog. It wasn't lost. Lost dogs are confused. This one knew exactly what it wanted. It had walked its feet bloody to get to a person, any person, and out of everyone in Hollow Creek it had found the one man standing alone in a parking lot before sunrise. "Okay," Walt said quietly. His voice had changed. The tiredness was gone out of it. "Okay, show me." The puppy was already running. It headed north, away from town, along the shoulder of the old county road that wound up toward Miller's Lake. Walt got in the cruiser and rolled alongside it at a crawl, window down, and every few seconds the puppy glanced sideways to make sure he was still there. He got on the radio, not because he had anything solid yet, just because 30 years had taught him that the moment your gut goes cold is the moment you tell somebody where you are. "Dispatch, this is Briggs. I'm heading north on County 9, past the diner, following a stray dog that's acting like something's wrong up here. Probably nothing. I'll advise." "Copy, Walt," came the voice back, dry and familiar. It was Dell who ran dispatch and half the town's gossip. Something wrong, how? I'll tell you when I know. The road climbed and narrowed. Frost lay heavy in the ditches on both sides, silver in the early light, and the puppy ran at the edge of it with its head down, driven, checking back over its shoulder, never slowing. Twice it stumbled on those raw paws, and Walt's chest tightened, but each time it caught itself and kept going, like stopping wasn't a thing it was allowed to do. They came up on Miller's Bend a mile out of town. Anyone from Hollow Creek could tell you about Miller's Bend. It's a bad curve where the road hooks left along a steep drop, and the county had been promising a guardrail there for as long as Walt had been alive. In October, before the sun clears the ridge, that stretch of road holds a skin of black ice you can't see until you're on top of it. The puppy stopped at the outside of the curve, stood there in the frost, rigid, staring down the slope into the trees below the road, and started to bark. Sharp, hard, over and over, its whole body flinching with each one. Walt stopped the cruiser and got out. At first he didn't see anything but the drop and the pines and the frost, and he thought, with a small guilty flood of relief, that maybe this really was nothing. Maybe the dog was just confused. Maybe there was a dead deer down there. He almost let himself believe it. Then he looked at the road. There were tire marks on the ice. Faint, but there. A long curved smear where a vehicle had lost its grip on the black ice and slid straight when the road bent, the tread skating sideways toward the edge and then just gone. No skid all the way to a stop. The marks ran off the shoulder and vanished over the lip of the slope, and the frost at the edge was churned and broken. Walt's whole body went still. "Dispatch," he said into the radio, and his voice came out flat and fast. "Briggs at Miller's Bend. I've got a single vehicle off the road. Looks like it went over the edge. I don't have eyes on it yet. Roll fire and an ambulance now and get the county on the line. I want a rescue crew. Now, Dell." "On it. Talk to me, Walt." He was already moving. Down off the shoulder, boots sliding in the frost, catching himself on a sapling, the puppy plunging down the slope ahead of him and crying the whole way. "Somebody drove off the road here," Walt said, breathing hard. "Overnight, I think. Frost's been laid down on top of the marks. This has been here for hours." Hours. He said the word and felt it. If somebody had been down here for hours, in that cold, through the whole night, he didn't finish the thought. He just went faster. The trees closed over him. The drop was steeper than it looked from the road, 40 feet of loose dirt and roots, and Walt went down half of it on his backside, grabbing at branches, the coffee and the retirement and the sheet cake all 1,000 miles away now. The puppy was already at the bottom. He could hear it barking somewhere in the pines below, that same frantic note, over and over. He came out into a shallow gully at the base of the slope. And there it was, a pickup truck, an old blue one, resting nose down against the trunk of a big pine that had probably been the only thing that stopped it. The front end was crushed and folded around the tree. The windshield had gone white with a spider web of cracks, one corner punched all the way through. It had come off the road, rolled at least once from the look of the crumpled roof, and slid to a stop down here where nobody driving past on the road above would ever see it. The puppy was at the driver's door, up on its hind legs, scratching and crying at the glass. Walt half ran, half fell the last few yards. The driver's window was shattered out, a hole punched in the web of safety glass, and he understood in a flash how the puppy had gotten free. It had squeezed through there and gone for help while its person stayed trapped inside. He got to the door and looked in, and his heart stopped. There was a woman in the driver's seat, small, elderly, white hair matted dark on one side with blood from a cut above her ear. She was pinned, the crushed dash pressing down against her legs. Her body slumped sideways against the seat belt at an angle that made Walt's breath catch. Her skin was a terrible color, gray going to blue at the lips, and she wasn't moving. "Ma'am." Walt reached through the broken window, careful of the glass, and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat. His hand was shaking. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" For a long, awful second there was nothing. Then, under his fingers, so faint he almost missed it, A pulse. Slow. Weak. But there. She's alive, Walt said out loud, to the puppy, to himself, to the empty trees. Oh, thank God. She's alive. The puppy pressed against his leg, shaking, its cries dropping to a low continuous whimper now that he was here. Walt keyed the radio again. Dispatch, I've got her. Elderly female, driver, single occupant that I can see. She's trapped, she's got a head injury, she's severely hypothermic, and she is unconscious, but she has a pulse. She has been out here all night, Del. I need that ambulance, and I need the extrication crew, and I need them 10 minutes ago. They're rolling, Walt. 6 minutes out on the ambulance. Rescue's behind them. Stay with her. Stay with her. As if he'd go anywhere. Walt shrugged off his coat and worked it through the broken window, tucking it around the woman's shoulders and chest as best he could reach, trying to put some warmth back into a body that had been giving it up to the cold for hours. Her hands were like ice. He took one of them and held it between both of his, rubbing, talking, keeping his voice low and steady the way you do. You hang on now. You hear me? Help's coming. You held on all night. You can hold on 6 more minutes. That's nothing. That's nothing at all. The puppy scrambled up into the window frame beside her and pressed its filthy little head against her cheek and licked at the blood on her face and made a sound Walt had never heard a dog make before. And down in the gray cold, holding a stranger's frozen hand, Walt Briggs felt his throat go tight for reasons he couldn't have explained yet. They were the longest 6 minutes of Walt's career. He stayed at the window the whole time, one hand holding hers, the other reaching in to keep the coat snug at her throat, talking without stopping because he'd read somewhere years ago that hearing matters, that a person can be a long way down and still hear a voice calling them back. There's a whole crew coming, he told her. Good people. They're gonna get you warm and get you out of here and get you to the hospital, and you're gonna be all right. Just stay with me. Keep breathing. That's it. Once her eyelids fluttered, just barely. A thin line of white and then closed again. Walt's heart jumped so hard it hurt. That's it, I saw that. You're in there. Come on now. Come on back. The puppy had gone quiet. It lay in the broken window frame with its body pressed to the side of her face, and it had stopped crying, and Walt realized after a minute that it was doing exactly what he'd read about. It was trying to keep her warm. It had been doing that all night, he'd bet anything. Curled against her in the freezing dark for hours, until the cold got bad enough that it did the one other thing it could think of. It squeezed out through a hole in the glass, and it walked its paws bloody looking for a human, and it did not stop until it found one. Then the sound of sirens came down the ridge. Walt had never in his life been so glad to hear that noise. Red lights strobed through the pines above them, and boots came crashing down the slope, and then the gully was full of people, 2 paramedics, then the volunteer fire crew, then the county rescue trucks crew hauling the heavy hydraulic tools down through the trees. Officer, step back, let us in. Walt stepped back, and it was like letting go of something he'd been holding up with his whole body. His legs nearly went out from under him. They worked fast. One paramedic was in through the passenger side, a cervical collar and warm packs and an oxygen line, calling numbers to the other. Core temp's way down. GCS is low. Pulse is thready, but she's got one. Let's move, let's move. The rescue crew set the spreaders against the crushed dash, and the tools screamed and the metal groaned and gave, an inch, then more, until they had her legs free. On my count, 1, 2, 3. They lifted her out onto the board so gently, this small gray-faced woman with somebody else's coat around her shoulders, and got her strapped and covered and started up the slope toward the road, 4 people passing her hand over hand up the steep dirt with the puppy scrambling alongside, refusing to be more than a foot from her. At the top, at the ambulance, one of the medics glanced down at the frantic dog and then at Walt. This hers? Yeah, Walt said. Then, because it was true, it's the reason she's alive. That dog walked to town and dragged me out here. She'd have died down there if it hadn't. The medic looked at the puppy for a second, something soft going over his face. "Right up front with me, then," he said to the dog, and scooped it up, all mud and burrs and blood, and set it in the cab. "You earned it." Walt drove behind the ambulance the whole way to the county hospital, lights on, and he did not once think about the fact that it was the middle of his shift, or that he was 6 days from a sheet cake, or any of it. He thought about a small gray hand going warm again between his palms. He thought, please, just please. He didn't even know her name yet. A quick note before we go on. If this story is getting to you the way it got to me, let me know down in the comments. Type the word copper if you're rooting for that little dog. You'll understand the name in just a minute. She lived. That's the first thing you need to know, so you're not sitting there worrying through the rest of it. By the time Walt had paced the ER waiting room raw and worn a groove in the linoleum, a doctor came out and told him she was stable. Severe hypothermia, a broken leg, 3 cracked ribs, a nasty gash on her scalp, and a concussion. But she was awake. She was talking. Whatever the odds had been at the bottom of that gully in the dark, she had beaten them, and the doctor said the words Walt would remember for the rest of his life. An hour later, and we'd be having a very different conversation. Whoever found her out there, that timing is the only reason she's alive. Walt didn't correct him about who found her. He'd stopped taking credit for that around the time he watched a 5-month-old puppy climb into an ambulance. They let him in to see her that evening. She was propped up in the bed, a bandage wrapped around her white hair, an IV line in the back of one thin hand, and she looked impossibly small under the blanket. But her eyes were open, and they were sharp, and they found Walt in the doorway right away, and her whole face changed. "Oh," she said. Her voice was cracked and quiet, but it came out with something in it that Walt didn't understand, a kind of wonder. "Oh, it's you." Walt stopped just inside the door, hat in his hands, suddenly awkward the way big men get in small rooms. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Briggs. Walt Briggs. I'm the one who found your truck this morning, but really it was your dog. He's the one who—" "Walter," she said. He stopped. Nobody called him Walter. Nobody had called him Walter in 40-some years. His mother had, when she was angry, and there'd been exactly one other person in the whole world who had ever used his full name, and she'd used it soft, the way you'd say it to a boy you hadn't given up on. The woman in the bed was smiling at him now, tears standing in her eyes, and she said it again, testing it, making sure. "Walter Briggs, you sat in the second row, by the window. You used to draw airplanes in the margins of your spelling tests instead of doing the spelling." The room tilted a little under Walt's feet. "Mrs. Bennet," he said. It came out of him without his say-so, from somewhere very far down and very long ago. 4th grade, Hollow Creek Elementary. "There he is," she whispered. Ada Bennet. He was looking at Ada Bennet. 50 years fell away all at once, and he was 9 years old again, a skinny, furious, fatherless kid who came to school angry because there wasn't enough of anything at home, who got sent to the principal twice a week, who everybody had already decided about. Everybody except the 4th grade teacher who kept him after class, not to punish him, but to sit with him, who let him draw his airplanes when the spelling made him want to throw the desk, who told a mean, scared little boy that she saw something good in him, something that was going to matter someday, and who said it enough times and meant it enough that some small part of him started, against all odds, to believe her. She was the reason. He'd never said it out loud to a soul, but Walt knew, standing in that hospital room, that Ada Bennet was the reason he'd put on the uniform in the first place. A kid who'd been written off by everyone had grown up wanting to be the person who didn't write people off. 30 years of driving drunks home instead of booking them, of sitting with grieving old men, of warnings instead of tickets. All of it traced back, if you followed the thread far enough, to a teacher who'd stayed late for him when nobody made her. "You were driving out to the lake," Walt said, the pieces coming together. "This morning, in the dark." Ada nodded, and the tears spilled over. "It was Harold's birthday. My husband. We used to go out to Miller's Lake every year on his birthday and watch the sun come up over the water since we were young." Her voice wobbled. "He's been gone 2 years. I couldn't stand the thought of not going. So I got up before light and I put Copper in the truck, and She stopped, her hand going to the bandage on her head. The road, the ice. I never even saw it. Copper, Walt said softly. My puppy. Harold always wanted a dog and never let himself have one. After he passed, I couldn't be in that house alone another winter, so I got a little pup for company. She let out a wet, broken laugh. Named him Copper for his coat under all that mud. He wasn't even supposed to save my life. He was just supposed to keep me from being lonely. Walt had to look at the floor for a second. He walked to town, Mrs. Bennet, he said when he could. Almost 3 miles. In the dark, in the cold. He walked his feet bloody and he found me in a parking lot and he would not let me alone until I followed him back to you. He looked up. He didn't leave you all night. And when leaving was the only thing left that might save you, he did that too. Ada Bennet reached out her thin hand across the blanket, the one without the IV, and Walt crossed the room without deciding to and took it. They told me, she said, the doctor told me, that another hour and I wouldn't have made it. She squeezed his fingers with what little strength she had. You know what I kept thinking about, out there in the dark? When I was drifting, when it was getting hard to stay awake? She looked up at him. I kept thinking, somebody's going to have to find me. Somebody's going to have to be kind enough to come all the way down into that cold and pull an old woman out. And I remember thinking, I hope, whoever it is, that they turn out to be the kind of person who bothers. She smiled up at him. This woman who had taught 1,000 children over her life, who had once bothered with the worst-behaved boy in the room. And it was you, Walter, of everyone in the whole world. It was the little boy who used to draw airplanes. That was when Walt Briggs came apart. He was 58 years old. He was a big, quiet, weathered man who had not cried in front of another living soul in longer than he could remember, who had held it together at his own mother's funeral, who had a reputation around Hollow Creek for being unshakable, and he stood there holding Ada Bennet's hand in a hospital room, and it all came up out of him at once, 30 years of it, and he could not stop it, and he did not try, because he understood finally what the puppy had done. It hadn't just picked a person at random. Walt would never be able to prove it, and he'd never try to explain it to anyone. But he knew, bone deep, that of all the mornings in all the years, on the very last week of a career he'd spent quietly wondering whether any of it had counted, a lost puppy had led him 3 miles up an icy road and handed him the one person on earth who'd told him, when he was 9, and nobody else would, that he was going to matter. He'd spent 30 years thinking the answer to that was a sheet cake and a badge that wasn't the right shape. And here was the answer, awake and alive and holding his hand, because he'd bothered to follow a crying dog instead of walking into a warm diner. Here was the woman who first believed in him, breathing, because the boy she believed in had grown up into exactly the man she said he would. You were right, Walt got out through it all, his voice wrecked. Mrs. Bennet, you were right about me. I never got to tell you. I don't think I'd have made any of it if you hadn't stayed late for me. All those years. Shh. She pulled his big hand to her cheek, the way you'd comfort a child, this tiny woman in a hospital bed comforting the officer who'd saved her. I know, Walter. I always knew. That's the whole reason I stayed. There was a scratch at the door. A nurse had brought Copper in, cleaned up now, the mud washed out to show the reddish coat he was named for, one paw bandaged, and the second the little dog saw Ada, he lost his mind with joy. He was up on the bed before anyone could stop him, careful of the broken leg somehow, pressing his whole trembling body against her, licking her chin, his tail going so fast it was a blur, making that high, happy crying sound that dogs make when the thing they were most afraid of losing turns out to be all right after all. Ada laughed and cried and buried her face in his fur. There's my boy. There's my brave, brave boy. And Copper, in the middle of it, twisted around and looked at Walt, looked right at him, the way he had in the parking lot at dawn, and then he leaned over and put his bandaged paw on Walt's arm, gentle, and rested it there. Walt lost it all over again. Ada Bennett went home 2 weeks later, walking with a cane and a lot of complaints about the cane, which the nurses took as an excellent sign. Walt's retirement party happened that Saturday at the VFW Hall, sheet cake and all, and it turned out the badge on the flyer was still the wrong shape, and Walt found that he didn't mind even a little. He stood up when they asked him to say a few words. This man who hated saying words, and he didn't talk about the 30 years or the 2 times he'd drawn his weapon or any of the things a man is supposed to talk about at a thing like that. He told them about a puppy that walked to town. He told them about a teacher who stayed late for a bad kid a lifetime ago and about 6 minutes at the bottom of a frozen gully. And he told them that he'd spent most of his career quietly convinced that the small things didn't add up to much, and that he'd been wrong about that, completely wrong, and it took a 5-month-old dog to prove it to him on the last week of the job. The room was very quiet when he finished. A few of the old-timers in the back were wiping their eyes and pretending it was the cold. He didn't retire lonely in the end. Ada was his teacher again, in a way, in the years that came after. He'd drive out to the house past Miller's Bend on Sunday afternoons and fix the things a widow's house needs fixing, and she'd make coffee too strong the way she liked it, and they'd sit and talk, 2 people who'd known each other across 50 years and one impossible morning. He was there the day the county finally put up the guardrail at the bend. Walt had made some calls. It turned out a retired officer with a good story has a way of getting things done. And Copper split his time between them. Half the week at Ada's, curled in the sun by Harold's old chair. Half the week riding shotgun in Walt's truck with his head out the window and his ears flying, the 2 of them going nowhere in particular, just going. People in Hollow Creek still tell the story. The morning the puppy wouldn't leave the officer alone. The 3 miles in the dark. The old teacher at the bottom of the ravine, and the man who found her, and how it turned out the finding ran both ways. But if you ask Walt Briggs about it, and folks do ask him, he won't tell it the way you'd expect. He won't say he saved her. He'll get quiet for a second, and then he'll say that on the last week of a job he thought had come to nothing, a scared little dog walked out of the cold and gave him the only thing he'd ever really wanted. Proof that it mattered, that all of it mattered. He just needed something small and brave enough to lead him to it. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me while I was telling it, do that little dog a favor and hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And I meant what I asked at the start. Tell me down in the comments where you're watching from, and while you're there, tell me, have you ever had an animal do something for you that you can't quite explain? Because I've got a feeling a lot of you have. Thank you for staying till the end. I'll see you in the next story.